First, I'd like to say about the talks I'm giving that, as many of you know, I'm not a Pali scholar or a sort of orthodox Buddhist teacher. I have a great love of inquiry, as you know, and been influenced by not only the Buddha, but Nagarjuna and Ramana Maharishi and Krishnamurti, all famous inquiry teachers. And not inquiry just for the sake of inquiry, but inquiry to the limit of our conceiving. And so I'm not afraid to tackle some pretty complex or out there questions. And tonight I'm going to talk about consciousness, which is probably at the forefront now of sort of neuroscience and investigation. And there seems to me to be two aspects of consciousness. And the first aspect is what I call the content of consciousness. And that's what you'd call the residue of experience. It's all the thoughts, the knowledge, the views, the beliefs, the memory, conscious and unconscious. All this that we would have acquired over our lifetime and probably even pre-lifetime. It's the conditioned consciousness, if you like. And this content of consciousness is then a filter through which we experience life day to day. So each of us has our own view of the world, dependent on our content of our consciousness. And this creates the world as we know it. So each of us has our own view, and we become that content of our consciousness. In other words, we always filter, if you like, but what it is we become familiar. We like the familiar. So if something's familiar, that means it is in our content of consciousness. Therefore, we can recognize it. Therefore, we feel it's an accurate view because it's part of we can recognize it through our past experience. And I'm not saying this is in any derogatory way or right or wrong. This is just the way things are for human beings. So in a way, our experience, our past experience, influences our present experience because we filter through that, and also creates our future experience because it's how we respond in the present which creates the future. And so this content of consciousness is in all areas of our life, how we respond. So what's important here, not, as I say, it's not no value judgment, it's just the way it is. But what is important is that we be aware of this is how it is. So what is important? Why is this important? Why is it important for us to be really aware that we're seeing the world through the past, through the content of our consciousness? It's important because, in a way, we're not seeing things afresh. And if we reflect on our experience of consciousness, it appears that each of us are the center of consciousness. In other words, we create a center in our consciousness that is conscious of what is happening. I am conscious of all you guys on the screen, and you're conscious of listening to me. So we've created a center in our consciousness. But this center is created through our content of who we think we are, all the experiences we've had that have developed and created our ego or self. So that center of our consciousness is just part of the content of consciousness. Yeah? And that is important to understand that, because then we don't cling to it. We don't have to identify with it. We just know that is how things are unfolding. And if in this creation of the center, and when we construct this center of consciousness, then each of us is a vehicle, if you like, for the world of experience as we know it. We experience the world through that consciousness and through that center. And it's a limited view, because the center is limited. The center is part of the content of consciousness, which is always limited. We only have limited experiences. Therefore, all those experiences we've accumulated, may they be immense, they're still limited. And that center that we've created out of that consciousness is therefore limited. So we have a limited view of the world, we have a limited view of ourselves, and it affects the way we respond. So are we truly aware, deeply aware, that the self is a construct out of our content of consciousness? In other words, do we really not believe or see the truth of that construct, that fabrication, and the material that we have to construct and put together the sense of self is just through this content of consciousness, through our conditioning, if you like. So by clinging to and attaching to any of that content of consciousness, which is all the knowledge we have, all the views and opinions, all the beliefs, clinging to any of that is clinging to a very limited view of life. And this is the beautiful thing about inquiry. This inquiry is not about right or wrong, or agreeing or not agreeing. Inquiry is outside of all this, outside of those dualities. So we're just exploring this whole idea of consciousness and this construct we have of who we are. So then we can ask the question, is the consciousness limited to its content? Is that all there is of consciousness? I don't think it is. Actually, I know it isn't. That consciousness, that content itself can keep expanding. 50 years ago, when nobody knew anything about the internet or Zoom or mobile phones, but they are now part of the content of our consciousness. They've been added to the consciousness. So that content of consciousness is continually expanding and can continually expanding because consciousness is infinite in its breadth. It's not limited by the content. So there's this continual expansion of consciousness, if you like. But of course, our view is always on the content. Our clinging is always to the content. because the content is what's familiar. It's challenging to look beyond the content, because then we're looking beyond the center. We're looking without any point of reference, if you like. So consciousness can appear to be captured or caught, fixated, and held in time. And because that's what the content is. It's placed in space, it's placed in time, and it is limited. Therefore, we lose that sense of the limitlessness, the incredible boundless quality of consciousness, because we cling to and identify with the content. So at this moment, is it possible to be conscious before the thought? Before the recognition? Before the description? Before the ownership? Because these are all the content. This is the content that is superimposed on the act of consciousness, the act of being conscious. Because consciousness is a verb, it's not a noun. It's not an object, it's a doing word. It's a doing word if we don't limit it to the content of consciousness. So, if we're going to drop that, cling to that center, the I am conscious, then consciousness is not personal. Consciousness, to make conscious personal, we have to say, I am conscious, or I am conscious of whatever. The I am conscious of the content of consciousness. The I itself is the content of consciousness. So if we think we should change, if we should be more this, more that, more compassionate, meditate more, be more mindful, the I that is saying that is still caught in the content of consciousness. Still in that same field. Still a conditioned movement. So what happens if we inquire into consciousness itself, the act of being conscious, into the very nature of consciousness? Without the answer being anything out of the content. We find we can't locate it. It has no structure. We can't describe it. It exists beyond conceiving. Because all the conceptions are all part of the content. The Buddha called it atamayata. And it's consciousness unbounded. In other words, it's consciousness not bound to the content. And he described that consciousness as limitless, boundless, and all luminous. So can we remember, be mindful of getting caught up and identifying with the content of consciousness? Can we rest in that limitless, boundless, and all luminous consciousness, the Atamayata. Thank you, everyone.